The knot in my stomach isn't fear. Not anymore. It's anticipation. A tightly coiled spring, waiting for the precise moment of release. Across the polished mahogany of the boardroom table, Daniel, my husband, catches my eye and gives a smug little wink. He thinks I'm here as his supportive wife, a silent ornament for his impending triumph. He straightened his already perfect tie for the 10th time this morning, his chest puffed out, lecturing me over lukewarm coffee about the boys' club and how I wouldn't understand the pressures of his world. "This promotion, Sarah," he'd said, his voice dripping with condescension, "it changes everything. We'll finally be on top, as if I were merely an extension of his ambition. His voice echoes in my mind, the one from last night, laced with that familiar casual cruelty. "You'll never find another man like me, Sarah." Face it, the heavy oak door of the boardroom creaks open, and Mr. Henderson, the CEO, walks in, his face a carefully constructed mask of neutrality. He offers a perfunctory nod to the assembled executives, his gaze lingering on me for just a beat too long. There's something there, a flicker. Acknowledgement? Daniel beams, practically vibrating. Henderson clears his throat. "Good morning, everyone. We have some significant news." He pauses, letting the silence stretch, a conductor savoring the hush before the crescendo. Then he turns, his eyes locking with mine. "I'd like you all to welcome the new owner of Henderson and Company." The world stops. Daniel's smile freezes, cracks, then shatters. If you've ever felt that delicious, almost unbearable tension just before a life-altering moment, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. Knowing you're out there helps me tell these stories, more than you know. Just 6 months ago, my world was a much smaller, grayer place. My days were measured in Daniel's moods. My ambitions were dust bunnies under the oversized furniture he'd chosen for a home. Our home. It always felt more like his showroom. I remember the day he bought the espresso machine, the one that cost more than my first car. He spent a week mastering it, then declared my attempts to use it charming but ultimately futile, like everything else I tried. My art, once a vibrant splash of color in my life, was relegated to the spare room, then the attic. "Hobbies are nice, Sarah," he'd say, patting my head, "but they don't pay the bills, do they?" His bills, mostly. My contribution, from a small trust my grandmother left me, was pin money, useful for little treats, never acknowledged as a substantial safety net he often dipped into when his own grand schemes hit a snag. He wasn't always like this. Or maybe he was, and I was just too young, too blinded by the charming facade he presented to the world. The Daniel I married was ambitious, yes, but he also seemed to see me. He'd listen, or pretend to. The shift was gradual, a slow erosion. With every promotion he got, every rung he climbed on the corporate ladder at Henderson and Company, I seemed to shrink. His victories became his alone, his world a place I was increasingly unwelcome, unless it was to play the role of the adoring, silent spouse at company dinners. Dinners where he'd regale his colleagues with thinly veiled anecdotes about my quirks, my naivete. I'd smile, a carefully constructed mannequin, while inside, something withered a little more each time. The evenings were the worst. He'd come home, smelling of stale office air and self-importance, and dissect his day, his triumphs, the incompetence of others. My attempts to share my own thoughts, my own small victories, a successful garden bloom, a particularly insightful book I'd read, were met with a distracted nod or, more often, an impatient, "Yes, yes, that's nice, Sarah." Now, about this quarter's projections. My voice became a whisper, then a thought, then a silence he filled with the booming echo of his own significance. I was drowning, and he was the water, oblivious, all-encompassing. He loved me, he'd say, usually after a particularly cutting remark, as if the words themselves could bandage the wound he'd just inflicted. "You know I love you, Sarah. I just want what's best for you. And what's best for you is to listen to me. I know how the world works." The inciting incident, the spark that finally lit the fuse of my dormant rebellion, wasn't a grand explosion. It was a small, almost insignificant comment, yet it landed with the force of a wrecking ball. I'd been quietly working on a business plan, a small online bookstore specializing in rare and first edition art books. It was my secret garden, a place where my passion for art and literature could bloom. I'd spent months researching, planning, even building a rudimentary website. One evening, feeling a flicker of my old courage, I decided to share it with him. I prepped his favorite meal, waited until he was relaxed, a glass of expensive scotch in his hand. "Daniel," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "I've been working on something. A little business idea." He looked up from his tablet, an eyebrow raised, a patronizing smile already forming. I pushed on, explaining my concept, my passion, the potential I saw. When I finished, the silence stretched. Then he chuckled. Not a warm, supportive chuckle. It was a dry, dismissive sound that scraped against my raw nerves. "An online bookstore? Sarah, that's quaint." He took a sip of his scotch. "Stick to your gardening, love. Or your painting. Those aren't safe. This business stuff, it's a shark tank. You'd be eaten alive." "Besides," he added, his voice taking on that familiar tone of superiority, "what would you use for capital? Your little pin money?" He waved a dismissive hand. "Leave the empire building to me. You just focus on making sure my shirts are ironed for the real battles." He turned back to his tablet, the conversation, and my dream, summarily dismissed. I stood there, the carefully prepared dinner growing cold, my meticulously crafted business plan feeling like a child's crayon drawing in my hands. It wasn't just the dismissal of my idea, it was the casual, unthinking cruelty of it. The way he so effortlessly crushed something that meant so much to me. That night, something inside me didn't just wither, it snapped. The image of him, so smug, so certain of his own brilliance and my utter insignificance, burned into my mind. That was the moment I stopped shrinking and started to smolder. He thought I was a harmless little hobbyist. He had no idea what he'd just unleashed. The fight wasn't just for a bookstore anymore. It was for my soul. My first steps were small, tentative, shrouded in secrecy. The pin money Daniel so casually dismissed was, in fact, a considerable sum. My grandmother, a shrewd woman who'd seen the steel in my spine even when I hadn't, had left me a well-managed investment portfolio. Daniel knew of its existence, but he never bothered with the details, assuming it was a trivial amount. He never asked to see the statements. His loss. I made an appointment with a financial advisor, Mrs. Albright, a woman whose calm competence was a balm to my frayed nerves. We met in a discreet coffee shop far from our neighborhood. Spreading out the statements, she confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. The portfolio had grown substantially over the years. It wasn't just pin money, it was a war chest. "Mrs. Davies," she said, her eyes kind but perceptive, "this is a significant asset. What do you intend to do with it?" I said, a new, unfamiliar resolve hardening my voice, to build something. For myself. The online bookstore was still a dream, but a bigger, bolder idea was beginning to germinate, something audacious, something that would make Daniel's world tilt on its axis. But I wasn't there yet. First, I needed to understand the terrain of his world, the world of business he so jealously guarded. I started reading financial news, business journals, anything I could get my hands on. I learned about mergers, acquisitions, valuations. Daniel, oblivious, would sometimes see me with the Wall Street Journal and chuckle. "Trying to keep up, are we?" It's cute, his condescension was fuel. Every dismissive remark, every patronizing smile, added another log to the pyre of my old self. The challenges were constant. Living a double life was exhausting. I'd feign interest in his monologues about Henderson Co, nodding in all the right places, while my mind was calculating P/E ratios or analyzing market trends. He started noticing my absences, my preoccupied silences. "You're quiet lately, Sarah. Something on your mind?" he'd ask, a hint of suspicion in his voice. "Just tired, Daniel," I'd reply, forcing a wan smile. "Maybe I should take up a new hobby. Something relaxing." His suspicion would morph back into condescension. "Yes, good idea. Maybe pottery. Something you can't get too ambitious about." The irony was a bitter pill I swallowed daily. The most ambitious project of my life was unfolding right under his arrogant nose. There were days I'd falter. The sheer scale of what I was contemplating, the potential for catastrophic failure, would overwhelm me. I'd lock myself in the bathroom, tears streaming down my face, the old voices of doubt whispering that Daniel was right, that I was out of my depth. But then I'd see his smug face in my mind's eye, hear his dismissive laughter, and the fire would reignite. I was not just building, I was reclaiming. The biggest challenge was the information. How could I get a true picture of Henderson & Company's financial health, its vulnerabilities, its real market value? Daniel, for all his boasting, was surprisingly cagey about specifics, especially when things weren't going perfectly. He painted a picture of relentless success, but I sensed cracks in the facade. There were more late nights, more hushed, tense phone calls he'd take in his study. His temper became shorter, his pronouncements more grandiose, as if to compensate for some unspoken anxiety. The midpoint shift came unexpectedly, like a plot twist in one of the thrillers I'd started devouring. I was at a charity luncheon, one of those events Daniel insisted I attend to network, though he really meant for me to be seen as his dutiful, decorative wife. I was seated next to a woman named Eleanor Vance, a retired investment banker with a reputation for being sharp as a tack and utterly discreet. During a lull in the conversation, I tentatively mentioned my interest in understanding more about corporate valuations. Perhaps it was the genuine curiosity in my voice, or perhaps she sensed something more, but she didn't patronize me. Instead, she started really talking about the market, about tells and trends. Companies in certain sectors, she mused, swirling her wine, especially family-run businesses that haven't adapted to new market realities, often find themselves over-leveraged and quietly looking for a lifeline. Or an exit. A name popped into my head. Henderson & Company. It was founded by Mr. Henderson's father. It had a solid, old-fashioned reputation, but was it adapting? What kind of signs would you look for? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Eleanor gave me a keen look. Delayed expansion plans. Sudden restructuring, that sounds more like cost-cutting. Key executives leaving. Sometimes the CEO starts spending a lot of time on the golf course with M&A guys. Daniel had been golfing a lot lately, with men whose names I didn't recognize from his usual circle. He complained about Henderson spending too much time schmoozing instead of leading. A jolt went through me. An idea, so audacious it made my heart pound, began to form. What if Henderson & Company was for sale? Quietly, of course. What if I could be that lifeline, or that exit? I spent the next few weeks in a fever of research, using everything Eleanor had taught me, cross-referencing public records, news snippets, industry gossip I found in obscure forums. The picture that emerged was startling. Henderson & Company wasn't the invincible behemoth Daniel portrayed. It was struggling. Profits were down, debt was up, and morale, according to some anonymous employee reviews I found, was plummeting. They were ripe for an acquisition. The online bookstore dream felt small now, a stepping stone. This was the empire I wanted to build. Not just any empire, but his. The irony was so potent, so delicious, it almost made me laugh out loud. Daniel, who thought I couldn't handle a simple online store, would soon be working for me. The game wasn't just on. The board was set, and I was about to make my first move. My pin money was about to become his entire world. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but now it was mixed with a thrilling, terrifying excitement. I was no longer a hobbyist. I was a player. The path to acquiring Henderson & Company was a tightrope walk over a chasm of potential disaster. My deepening crisis wasn't a sudden collapse, but a slow, grinding attrition of my nerves and resources. Every day was a battle fought on two fronts, the external one of complex financial negotiations and due diligence, and the internal one against Daniel's oblivious, suffocating presence. He was at his worst during this period, ironically because things at Henderson & Company were becoming more volatile. He'd come home stressed, taking it out on me with sharper criticisms, longer, more demanding monologues about his indispensability. Henderson is losing his grip, he'd rant, pacing the living room. The old man doesn't know how to navigate this market. If it weren't for me holding my department together, the whole place would implode. They're talking about a big deal, some kind of merger or acquisition to shore things up. He actually asked for my input on a few strategic points. Finally recognizing my value, I would nod, my face a mask of wifely concern, while inside, my heart hammered. The big deal he was referring to was my deal. My lawyers and financial advisors, led by the formidable Mrs. Albright and a discreet M&A specialist Eleanor Vance had recommended, were in delicate, high-stakes negotiations with Henderson's team. Every cryptic comment Daniel made, every piece of misinformed office gossip he shared, I had to filter, analyze, and sometimes pass on to my team. The secrecy was a crushing weight. There were moments I was certain he knew. A stray document I'd left on my desk, a phone call I'd taken in a hushed voice, thinking he was out. He'd look at me with a narrowed, suspicious gaze. "You're being very secretive lately, Sarah. What are you really up to with all these appointments?" "Just exploring some art courses, Daniel." I'd lie, my palms sweating. "Trying to find a new hobby, like you suggested." He'd scoff.
Art course? Right.
"Well, don't strain yourself. We wouldn't want you getting any big ideas." The condescension was almost a relief. It meant he hadn't guessed. Not even close. The deal itself almost fell through twice. Once, a rival bidder emerged, a larger corporation looking to swallow Henderson and Company whole. My team worked around the clock, restructuring the offer, leveraging my position as a private, committed buyer rather than a corporate raider. Mr. Henderson, it turned out, preferred the idea of his legacy passing to someone who seemed to care about the company's core, rather than just its assets. I had several discreet, late-night meetings with him, convincing him of my vision, a vision I had to articulate without once mentioning my primary, personal motivation. He was a shrewd old man. He saw something in my eyes, some unyielding determination, and perhaps a hunger that matched his own in his younger days. The second time, it was during the due diligence. We uncovered some financial irregularities, nothing illegal, but certainly glossed over in the initial prospectus. Daniel's department, as it happened, was one of those showing unexpected inefficiencies. The irony was so thick, I could have choked on it. My team wanted to pull out or drastically reduce the offer. I almost agreed. The stress was unbearable. I wasn't sleeping. I was losing weight. I'd look in the mirror and see a stranger, pale and haunted, but with a fire in her eyes that scared even me. Was I doing this for the right reasons? Was it revenge? Or was it something more? Was I strong enough to see this through? And even if I succeeded, what then? One night, Daniel came home particularly smug. "Looks like that big deal is finally coming together," he announced, pouring himself a generous scotch. "Henderson is practically glowing. Probably got a golden parachute out of it. And I, my dear Sarah, am positioned perfectly. Whoever takes over will need me. They'll see my value," he winked. "Maybe then you'll finally appreciate what you've got. You'll never find another man like me, you know." That was it. That was the sentence. The casual arrogance, the utter blindness. It was like a splash of icy water. My doubts vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. I would not falter. I would not break. This wasn't just about him anymore.
It was about me.
It was about every woman who'd ever been told she was small, insignificant, incapable. The turning point wasn't a single, dramatic event, but a quiet, internal shift. After Daniel's smug pronouncement that night, I went into my small study, the one he rarely entered. Considering it my hobby room, I looked at the piles of financial reports, legal documents, market analyses that had become my life. The fear was still there, a humming undercurrent, but above it, a new clarity had settled. I called Mrs. Albright first thing the next morning. "The irregularities in Daniel's department," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor it usually held when discussing him. "They're manageable. We adjust the offer slightly, but we proceed. I want this company, Eleanor. I'm not backing down." There was a pause on the other end, then Mrs. Albright's calm, measured voice. "I understand, Sarah. We'll make it happen. The final weeks were a blur of intense negotiations, late-night calls, and meticulous planning. My team was extraordinary. They saw my resolve, and it seemed to galvanize them. We structured the final offer, addressing the due diligence concerns, and presenting a compelling vision for Henderson and Company's future, a future that, unbeknownst to most, would be a radical departure from its past. Mr. Henderson, for reasons I could only guess at, perhaps a desire for a clean break, perhaps a genuine belief in my capabilities, or perhaps a shrewd understanding that my personal stake made me a uniquely motivated buyer, accepted the revised offer. The day I signed the final papers, my hand barely trembled. I sat in a sterile lawyer's office, the scent of old paper and new money in the air. Mr. Henderson was there, looking older, more tired, but with a strange look of relief in his eyes. He shook my hand, a firm, dry grip. "Good luck, Mrs. Davies," he said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "I believe you'll do great things." "Thank you, Mr. Henderson," I replied. "I intend to." Walking out of that office, the city seemed brighter, the air crisper. I was the owner of Henderson and Company. The secret was mine, a heavy, powerful weight in my chest. Daniel was at home, probably complaining about the traffic or the incompetence of his subordinates, utterly oblivious that the ground beneath his feet had fundamentally shifted. He had no idea that the pin money he'd mocked, the hobbyist wife he dismissed, now held his entire professional fate in her hands. The power felt clean. Cold, yes, but clean. It wasn't the giddy thrill of revenge I'd half expected. It was the quiet, steely satisfaction of a complex plan perfectly executed. The supportive wife was gone. A CEO was taking her place. The stage was set for the final act, and I, for the first time in a very long time, felt completely, utterly in control. All that was left was the reveal. The boardroom is cold, despite the late morning sun angling through the large windows. It's a purposeful cold, I think, designed to keep everyone alert, or perhaps just a reflection of the atmosphere Mr. Henderson cultivated. Daniel is practically preening. He'd spent an extra 20 minutes in front of the mirror this morning, selecting his most powerful tie, a garish silk thing with diagonal stripes he believed screamed executive material. He'd even offered me some unsolicited advice on my own attire. "You should wear that blue dress, Sarah. Makes you look presentable. We want to make a good impression for my big day." I'd chosen a charcoal gray suit instead, impeccably tailored, understated but radiating an authority he'd never seen in me. He hadn't commented, too wrapped up in his own impending glory. Now, he stands near the head of the long mahogany table, schmoozing with a couple of senior VPs, his laughter a little too loud, his gestures a little too expansive. He's performing, assuming this meeting is about his long-awaited promotion to a senior executive role, perhaps even Henderson's successor. The poor, deluded fool. He catches my eye, gives me that condescending wink again, as if to say, "See? I told you I was going places." I offer a small, enigmatic smile in return. Patience. Just a little more patience. The door opens, and Mr. Henderson walks in. He looks tired, older than he did just a few weeks ago when we signed the papers. His eyes meet mine briefly, a quick, almost imperceptible nod. He's a man of his word. He'd agreed to make the announcement himself, a final act of transition. He takes his place at the head of the table. The chatter dies down. The air crackles with expectation. Daniel puffs out his chest slightly, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "Good morning, everyone," Henderson begins, his voice raspy. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. We have some significant news regarding the future of Henderson and Company." He pauses, letting the silence hang heavy. I can feel Daniel almost vibrating with anticipation next to me. He probably thinks Henderson is about to anoint him. "As some of you know," Henderson continues, "the company has been exploring strategic options to ensure its continued growth and success in a changing market." He glances around the table, his gaze sweeping over the anxious faces. "After careful consideration and extensive negotiation, I have made a decision." Another pause. My heart is a steady, rhythmic drum against my ribs. Not nervous, just ready. Henderson turns, his gaze now fixed directly on me. The other executives follow his line of sight, their expressions shifting from curiosity to confusion. Daniel's smile wavers, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I'd like you all to welcome," Henderson says, his voice clear and firm, "the new owner and CEO of Henderson Co."
He gestures towards me.
Mrs. Sarah Davies. The silence that crashes down is absolute, a physical force. It's the kind of silence that sucks all the air out of the room. I see Daniel's face. It's a slow-motion catastrophe. The smugness freezes, then cracks, like thin ice under sudden weight. Disbelief washes over him, raw and stark, followed by a wave of dawning horror. His jaw literally drops. His eyes, wide and unblinking, are fixed on me, then dart to Henderson, then back to me, as if trying to reconcile an impossible equation. I meet his gaze, my expression calm, perhaps even a little cool. There's no triumph in my eyes, not yet. Just a quiet statement of fact. One of the VPs, a man named Richards, clears his throat. "Mrs. Davies?" Daniel's wife. The confusion is palpable. "Yes," I say, my voice even, carrying easily in the stunned silence. "Sarah Davies." Though I prefer Ms. Davies in a professional context, Daniel makes a strange, choking sound. His face has gone a ghastly shade of pale, then flushes a dark, mottled red. He looks like he's been punched in the gut. He opens his mouth, then closes it, a fish gasping for air. But how? He finally stammers, his voice a hoarse whisper. His eyes are wide, uncomprehending, searching mine for an answer. For some sign this is an elaborate, cruel joke. "It's a long story, Daniel," I reply, allowing a hint of steel into my voice. "Perhaps we can discuss it in my new office later. Say, after you've cleared your desk?" The dry humor, a bitter tang, is purely for me. His face contorts, a mask of fury, humiliation, and utter bewilderment. The man who told me I'd never find another like him, who told me to stick to my hobbies, who dismissed my intelligence and ambition at every turn, is now staring at his wife, his boss, the new owner of his entire professional world. Mr. Henderson, ever the pragmatist, clears his throat again, breaking the spell. Ms. Davies has a bold new vision for Henderson Co. I have every confidence in her leadership. He pushes his chair back. "My tenure here is officially over. The company is in your hands, Ms. Davies." He gives me another nod, then walks out of the boardroom, leaving me alone with my new executive team and my husband. Or rather, my new employee. The air is still thick, but now it's with the aftershock of a seismic explosion. Daniel just stands there, frozen, his world utterly, irrevocably demolished. He looks small. So very small. And for the first time in years, I feel expansive. The aftermath was not the explosion of righteous fury or dramatic confrontation I'd sometimes fantasized about during the darkest days. Daniel didn't scream or rail in the boardroom. He simply deflated. Like a punctured Michelin man, all his bluster and arrogance hissed out of him, leaving behind a bewildered, slack-jawed shell. He stumbled out of the boardroom after Mr. Henderson, muttering something about needing air, avoiding my gaze, avoiding everyone's. The other executives, after a moment of stunned silence, began to offer hesitant congratulations, their eyes filled with a mixture of shock, curiosity, and a dawning, wary respect. My first address to them was brief, calm, and focused on the future, on stability and growth. I didn't mention Daniel. I didn't need to. His absence was a louder statement than any words I could have uttered. He was waiting for me when I got home that evening, or rather, when I got to what was still, technically, our home. The house felt different, charged with a new, unspoken tension. He was in the living room, the grand, oversized room that had always felt more like his stage. He wasn't pacing or ranting. He was sitting on the edge of one of his expensive sofas, looking utterly broken. The power suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, his face pale and drawn. "Sarah," he began, his voice raspy, unfamiliar. All the booming confidence was gone.
Why?
It was a simple question, but the answer was a decade deep. I didn't sit. I stood, looking at him, the man I had once loved, the man who had systematically tried to diminish me.
Why?
I repeated softly. Because you told me to stick to my hobbies, Daniel. Because you told me I'd never find another man like you. Because you thought my pin money was a joke. Because for 10 years, you made me feel small so you could feel big. He flinched at each reason, as if they were physical blows. I didn't mean, he stammered. I always loved you, Sarah. I have a certain way. Yes, I said, my voice quiet but firm. You do. And that way almost erased me. This wasn't just about Henderson and Company, Daniel. This was about me reclaiming myself. You just happened to be standing in the way. He looked up, a flicker of his old manipulative cunning in his eyes. So, what now? You expect me to work for you? To report to my own wife? He tried for a scoff, but it came out as a pathetic whimper. No, Daniel, I said. I don't expect that at all. In fact, your position, as you may have gathered from the inefficiencies in your department's recent performance reports, is under review. But I imagine you'll want to tender your resignation before that review is complete. It would be less awkward for everyone. The fight went out of him completely. He slumped, his shoulders bowed. You planned this all along, didn't you? Every step. Not all along, I admitted. But for long enough. You never saw me, Daniel. You saw a reflection of what you wanted me to be. An accessory. A support system. You never once considered I might have ambitions, intelligence, or resources of my own that far exceeded your narrow view. The divorce papers were served a week later. He tried to fight, of course. His lawyers argued for a significant portion of my company, claiming marital assets. My lawyers, armed with meticulous documentation of the source of my funds, grandmother's trust, untouched by marital contribution, and his own long history of financial and emotional dismissal, systematically dismantled his claims. He ended up with his personal effects, a portion of the equity in the house, which I bought him out of, swiftly and clinically, and a severely bruised ego. The pin money he'd scoffed at had not only bought the company, but also secured my complete financial independence from him. Taking the helm of Henderson and Company was daunting. There were whispers, doubts. Some saw me as the scorned wife, on a power trip. But slowly, with quiet determination, clear strategy, and a willingness to listen to the people who actually did the work, I began to turn things around. I promoted talent from within, streamlined outdated processes, and invested in innovation. The inefficiencies in Daniel's old department were cleaned up with surprising ease once the dead weight at the top was removed. Mr. Henderson, to my surprise, became an occasional, informal advisor, offering gruff but insightful wisdom over coffee. He seemed to genuinely enjoy seeing the company he'd built revitalized, even if it was by someone he'd never anticipated. There were lonely nights, of course. The sprawling house felt too big for one person. The victory, as complete as it was, had a bittersweet edge. I hadn't just defeated a bully. I had dismantled a life, a marriage, however toxic it had become. There was a quiet grief for the naive young woman I had been, the one who had believed in a different kind of future with Daniel. But that grief was overshadowed by a growing sense of peace, of rightness. Months later, I was in my office, the one that used to be Henderson's, looking out over the city skyline. It was late. The lights of the city twinkled like scattered diamonds. My desk was clear, the day's work done. I felt a sense of ownership, not just of the company, but of myself, my life, my future. Daniel, I heard, had moved to another city, taken a much smaller job. Friends reported he was a shadow of his former self, bitter and diminished. I felt a pang, not of pity, but of a distant, clinical sadness for the potential he had squandered, the man he might have been if his ego hadn't consumed him. He told me I'd never find another man like him.
He was right.
I wasn't looking for another man like him or otherwise. I had found something far more valuable, far more enduring. I had found myself, and she was more than enough. She was, in fact, just getting started. If this story hit close to home, If you've ever had to reclaim your own space in a world that tried to make you small, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these stories to life, and I truly appreciate every single one of you.